Is Biden's policy towards the Israel-Hamas war a disaster? This question has been echoing in the corridors of power and in the minds of many around the world. When the war broke out, following a deadly cross-border raid by Hamas that resulted in the deaths of at least 1,200 Israelis, the Biden administration adopted a dual approach. On one hand, it allowed Israel to continue its war with the backing of American military assistance and diplomatic protection. On the other, it made efforts to prevent the crisis from escalating into a regional conflict. President Biden's strategy was rooted in a complex blend of geopolitical considerations, historical alliances, and a desire to maintain regional stability. But as the war raged on, the effectiveness of this dual policy started to come under question. 3.5 months later, the conflict is far from over, and the crisis has already spread across the region. The Biden administration's unwavering support for Israel was evident, even as casualties rose in Gaza and international pressure mounted on Israel to halt the attacks. Meanwhile, efforts to prevent the crisis from escalating, led by top diplomat Antony Blinken, have met with mixed success. The U.S. has substantial diplomatic leverage with Arab leaders, but it lacked similar influence with Iran, a key player in the region. The question that now looms large is whether the Biden administration's policy towards the Israel-Hamas war has been effective or whether it has been a disaster. With the war far from over and the crisis spreading across the region, the effectiveness of Biden's policy comes under scrutiny. Even as casualties rise and international pressure mounts, the Biden administration's support for Israel remains unflinching. As the conflict continues, the international community has called for a halt to the violence, seeking a humanitarian ceasefire through a UN Security Council resolution. Yet the Biden administration vetoed this proposition, standing firm in its support for Israel. Moreover, when the UN General Assembly presented resolutions criticizing Israel's actions and occupation, the US voted against them, further showcasing its unwavering support for Israel. This stance is maintained even in the face of escalating humanitarian crisis. The war has taken an unimaginable toll on the Palestinian population. Over 26,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have lost their lives, and more than 60,000 have been wounded. This war has displaced nearly 90% of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people, pushing them into a state of dire uncertainty. Amidst this backdrop, the International Court of Justice, the top court of the United Nations, issued a mandate last week. It ordered Israel to implement measures to prevent genocidal acts by its forces in Gaza. Yet even in the face of such an order, the Biden administration has not called for a ceasefire. The plea for peace, for a break in the violence, remains unanswered by the U.S. administration. Instead, the U.S. continues to pour support into Israel, backing its actions and providing military assistance. This support comes despite the rising casualties, the mounting international pressure, and the devastating humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. While Biden's unwavering support for Israel is clear, the humanitarian cost of this policy is devastating. Preventing the crisis from escalating is a priority for the Biden administration. However, increased attacks from Iran-backed militias pose a significant challenge. To manage the situation, Mr. Biden has deployed his top diplomat, Antony Blinken, to the region several times. Blinken's mission was to engage with Arab leaders, with whom the U.S. typically enjoys a substantial degree of diplomatic leverage. But here's where the problems start to stack up. Despite having significant influence over Arab leaders, the U.S. has found itself in a predicament with Iran. The lack of diplomatic leverage with Iran is a glaring issue, particularly when the main security challenges stem from Iran-backed militias in West Asia. Two types of attacks have been especially concerning. First, there's the Islamic Resistance Forces, Shia militias based in Iraq and Syria. These groups have launched at least 150 attacks against U.S. forces and bases in the region since October 7th. Second, there are the Houthis, Shia rebels from Yemen. They've been attacking commercial vessels in the busy shipping lanes of the Red Sea, directly challenging the U.S.'s ability to provide security to global shipping. In response, the U.S. has taken a familiar route, conducting retaliatory airstrikes in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The U.S. has carried out at least 6 strikes in Yemen, targeting Houthi positions. However, these airstrikes have done little to deter these homegrown militias. The Houthis, for instance, have survived 7 years of Saudi bombing and continue to control large portions of Yemen's territories, including its Red Sea coast and ports. As the situation stands, the effectiveness of America's response is yet to be seen. The classic approach of military retaliation has been the go-to response, but without diplomatic leverage with Iran and a sustainable strategy to curb Iran-backed militia attacks, the effectiveness of this approach remains uncertain. The U.S.'s military response to these attacks shows a classic approach, but the effectiveness is yet to be seen. With the U.S. strikes proving ineffective and the crisis escalating, the question remains, is Biden's policy towards the Israel-Hamas war a disaster? The U.S. has launched numerous airstrikes against Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, yet these retaliatory measures have done little to deter the homegrown militias. The Shia rebels of Yemen, known as the Houthis, continue to challenge the U.S.'s ability to provide security to global shipping, with attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea becoming a popular recruitment tool among their base. Despite 7 years of bombing by Saudi Arabia, the Houthis control vast territories in Yemen, including its Red Sea coast and ports. The U.S.'s attempts to curb these attacks, including seeking China's help, have seemingly fallen short. The escalating crisis, coupled with the ineffective U.S. strikes, paints a bleak picture of the current situation. As the situation continues to unfold, one thing is clear. The question of whether Biden's policy towards the Israel-Hamas war is a disaster is more relevant than ever.